The woods of rural Tennessee have always had their secrets, but none as old or as venomous as the one that began on a cold October night in 1934. The trees back then were younger, but even they seemed to bow and twist away from the small clearing where a crowd of whispering figures gathered, holding lanterns that flickered like dying souls. At the center of them stood a girl, thin, pale, and trembling, clutching a wilted bouquet of wildflowers as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Beside her, a man at least 3 times her age rested a rigid hand on her shoulder, his expression empty, his eyes hollowed as though carved from wood. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly. The wedding was not meant to be celebrated, it was meant to be hidden. For decades, the townspeople pretended it never happened. They buried the rumors under layers of silence, warnings, and fear, hoping time would smother the truth. But time doesn't bury everything, not in Tennessee, not in those woods. And when an old cabin was found last winter, locked from the inside with no footprints in the snow around it, the past clawed its way back. The cracked marriage certificate, the eerie photograph, the journal pages scattered across the floorboards, they were not just relics. They were confessions. The deeper investigators dug, the more the forest seemed to push back, as though guarding the memory of that night. Lantern lights were seen again, drifting between the trees long after midnight. Whispers echoed through the branches, carrying a warning that had chilled generations. And somewhere beyond the trail, where moss grows thicker than grass and the air feels unnaturally still, people swear they have seen 2 figures standing hand in hand, one tall, one small, watching, waiting, as if the ceremony never truly ended. The discovery of the abandoned cabin began as nothing more than an accidental detour taken by 2 hikers who had wandered off the marked trail in search of a better view of the valley. What they found instead was a structure so unnervingly out of place that it felt like the woods themselves were trying to swallow it whole. The cabin sat crooked among the trees, its roof sagging under decades of rot, its windows boarded from the inside as though something had been meant to stay trapped. Thick vines crawled up its walls like veins, wrapping the building in a living shroud. The hikers at first mistook it for an old hunting shack, but the closer they approached, the more the air shifted into something heavier, quieter, and far more unsettling. Even the birds seemed to avoid the space around it. The front door was swollen with age and half sunk into the warped frame, but deep claw-like gouges etched across the wood suggested past attempts to leave or enter in desperation. The hikers, curious yet increasingly uneasy, circled the cabin and noticed that every possible entry point, windows, vents, even gaps between planks, had been covered and sealed from within. It was as if whoever lived there had not wanted light getting out and certainly didn't want anyone looking in. The only thing untouched by time was a small, rusted latch securing the door, as if someone had locked it from the inside and never reopened it. The ground surrounding the building was strangely undisturbed, no footprints, no animal tracks, not even the usual disturbance of fallen branches. It was as though the forest had drawn an invisible line and refused to cross it. When authorities later arrived, they found themselves battling not only the dense undergrowth but a palpable sense of dread that thickened the deeper they ventured into the trees. Breaking open the door triggered a rush of stale, cold air carrying a faint smell of damp paper and something older, almost metallic. Dust floated like ash in the beam of the investigators' flashlights, illuminating the interior where objects were frozen in time, untouched for decades. A rusted metal bed frame, a collapsed rocking chair, and shelves lined with rotting jars created a scene that felt less like abandonment and more like someone had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. But the most disturbing detail was the absolute absence of disturbance inside. Nothing was broken, nothing misplaced, nothing looted. It was as if the cabin had been protected, preserved, deliberately hidden. And as the team moved deeper into the single, narrow room, one of them stepped onto a creaking floorboard that shifted just enough to reveal a thin crack beneath it, hinting at the first clue that this discovery was far more than a forgotten shelter lost to time. The forgotten marriage certificate was first noticed as a brittle curl of paper protruding from beneath a loose floorboard, its edges browned and flaking like the remains of a long-dead leaf. When the investigators lifted it out carefully, the document nearly crumbled in their hands, preserved only by the darkness that had shielded it from sunlight for decades. At first glance, it resembled nothing more than an old family record, the kind commonly kept in rural homes where official documentation was scarce. But as the dust was brushed away and the faded ink slowly revealed itself, the truth became clearer and far more disturbing. The names written on the certificate did not belong to strangers or distant relatives, they were the names of a young girl and her father's brother. The date beside the names placed the ceremony in the early 1930s, at a time when the area's isolation often concealed secrets that never reached the outside world. Yet even within the context of the era, the pairing was jarring enough to raise immediate alarm. The handwriting itself was fragile, uneven, as though the person writing it had been rushed or trembling. The witness signatures, barely legible, suggested others had been present, yet every mark on the paper felt haunted by reluctance, fear, or coercion. There was no official stamp, no government seal, no sign the document had ever been filed with any county office. It was a marriage recorded only in ink and silence, never meant for public eyes. The paper carried faint smudges that looked like fingerprints, smaller than an adult's, as though the girl herself had handled it at some point. The investigators could not determine whether she had been forced to sign or if someone had guided her hand, but the uneven pressure of the strokes implied a young, unsteady grip. As the discovery circulated among the investigative team, an eerie weight settled over the cabin. This was no longer just an abandoned structure, it was a shrine to a decision that defied morality and law, hidden for reasons that suddenly felt darker than mere shame. The lack of official registration suggested intentional secrecy, and the location of the certificate, buried under the floor, hinted that someone had taken great care to ensure it would not be found. Every question raised by the document produced another, even more unsettling one. Why was the girl married to her uncle? Who had arranged the ceremony? What had become of her afterward? And why had the residents of the nearby town worked so hard to erase every trace of the family's existence? The marriage certificate, fragile yet horrifyingly intact, became the key that unlocked the first door to a secret the woods had guarded for nearly a century. In the dim cabin light, it stopped being a piece of paper and became evidence of a ritual no one wanted to acknowledge but could no longer deny. When authorities carried the marriage certificate back to town and quietly began asking questions, the reaction they received was unlike anything they had expected. In a place where gossip usually traveled faster than weather forecasts, there was suddenly a silence so complete it felt rehearsed. Shopkeepers who were normally eager to chat fell mute the moment the investigators mentioned the cabin. Elderly residents who had lived in the area their entire lives suddenly claimed they didn't remember much from that time and shut their doors before any follow-up questions could be asked. Even younger townspeople, who logically should have known nothing about events nearly a century old, reacted with discomfort, glancing toward the woods as if expecting someone to be listening. The air of tension was unmistakable, as though the mere mention of the family's name was enough to awaken something everyone had hoped would stay buried. It was not the kind of silence rooted in ignorance but one rooted in fear. The sheriff, a man who had served the community for over 3 decades, offered only vague warnings about letting old things lie and suggested the investigators focus on more current issues. His eyes, however, betrayed something deeper, an unease that flickered whenever the cabin or the marriage certificate was mentioned. At the diner, a waitress dropped an entire tray of glasses when asked if she had ever heard stories about the family. Her hands shook as she muttered that some things were never meant to be talked about and hurried away before more questions could be asked. The reactions became eerier with each attempt to gather information. A barber turned off his radio and locked the door mid-haircut just to avoid discussing the topic. A group of men playing cards outside the hardware store exchanged glances before abruptly scattering, as if being seen talking about the matter could bring consequences. One of the few who dared to speak, a middle-aged mechanic with a calm face and trembling voice, warned that people who had asked too many questions about the family in the past had lost things they loved or had simply left town and never returned. He refused to elaborate, but the implication was heavy, and his refusal to make eye contact lingered long after the conversation ended. What unsettled investigators most was that no one denied the story. No one claimed the marriage certificate was fake or that the abandoned cabin was unrelated to the rumors. Instead, they treated it like something sacred and dangerous, a wound that should never be reopened. Their silence was a shield, but also a confession, one that revealed just how deeply the memory of that family was etched into the bones of the town. The more questions the investigators asked, the more they realized the community had been built on foundations of avoidance and fear, carefully crafted over generations. And beneath that silence, trembling at the heart of the town's reluctance, was the unmistakable truth that the residents were not just hiding a story, they were hiding from it. The photograph that shouldn't exist emerged from a stack of decaying papers found inside a tarnished metal box tucked behind the cabin's collapsed wardrobe. At first, it looked like nothing more than a scrap of black and white film stuck to a sheet of moldy cardboard, but when the investigators separated it carefully, the image snapped into focus with an unsettling clarity. The picture showed a girl, no older than 14, standing beside a man who appeared significantly older, his face gaunt and expressionless. Their posture was rigid, almost unnatural, as if someone had positioned them like mannequins just before the shutter clicked. What made the photograph especially disturbing was the lack of any visible emotion. Neither fear nor joy nor rebellion flickered in their eyes. They simply stared forward, blank and hollow, as though their humanity had been drained long before the picture was taken. Behind them, a cluster of shadowed figures could be faintly seen at the edge of the frame, their features blurred, possibly by motion or possibly because whoever developed the film had tampered with it. The backdrop revealed twisted trees and uneven ground that matched the woods surrounding the cabin, but there was something else in the picture, something harder to identify. A faint outline hung above the man's shoulder, like the ghostly impression of a hand reaching from the darkness, though whether it was a smudge, a trick of the light, or something far more sinister remained unclear. The edges of the photograph were crisp, not torn or weathered like the other objects in the room, raising the question of how it had survived decades without fading. The investigators were troubled by the fact that the girl's clothing resembled a makeshift wedding dress, white fabric, hand-stitched, with uneven seams that suggested it had been crafted in haste. The man wore a coat that seemed too formal for the wilderness, its buttons gleaming faintly despite the film's age. Someone had clearly wanted to document the moment, even if the ceremony had been meant to stay hidden. No one in town had admitted to seeing the photo before, yet several older residents turned pale when shown a scanned copy, refusing to look at it for more than a second. One woman crossed herself and whispered that the photograph should have never surfaced. Another claimed the picture was cursed because everyone who'd seen the original back then had fallen ill or met with unexplained tragedies. The image became the most haunting piece of evidence yet, not because of what it revealed outright, but because of what it implied: the presence of witnesses, the certainty of intention, and the chilling possibility that the ceremony had been more than a family secret. It was a moment frozen in time that should have vanished with the people involved, yet it had endured, offering silent testimony to a truth the town had tried desperately to erase. The cemetery keeper was the first person willing to speak without trembling, though even he hesitated before answering the investigators' questions. He had worked the grounds for more than 40 years, tending to graves that stretched back generations, yet he insisted he had never once seen a headstone bearing the family's name. At first, this seemed strange. Families in small Tennessee towns usually had entire sections of a cemetery to themselves, resting together in death just as they had lived close in life. But when asked directly where the family's dead were buried, the keeper's eyes drifted toward the tree line bordering the cemetery, and a quiet, uneasy sigh escaped him. He explained that some families, especially those with secrets or reputations they wished to keep hidden, held their own burials far from town. It was not common, but it was not unheard of either. What made this particular case unsettling was the way he spoke of those forest burials, softly, reluctantly, as if each word cracked open a memory he had spent decades trying to forget. He recounted hearing distant chanting carried on the wind during his early years working the cemetery, often late at night, long after the gates were locked. He had assumed the sounds were from nocturnal animals until he realized they came in rhythmic intervals, almost like hymns sung by a small group. Once, curiosity had driven him to follow the sound into the woods, but as soon as he stepped off the main path, the chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. He had turned back immediately, feeling watched by unseen eyes between the trees. After that, he learned to ignore strange noises and unexplained lights flickering deep in the forest. What troubled him most were the mounds he occasionally saw during the day, small, uneven patches of disturbed soil far from any known trails. They were not fresh graves, yet they bore the unmistakable shape of burial sites. Whenever he approached one to inspect it, he found signs of recent activity: wilted flowers, remnants of burned candles, and once even a rusted lantern still warm to the touch despite no one being in sight. He admitted that he never reported these discoveries, partly out of fear and partly because the townspeople seemed content pretending the forest burials didn't exist. He knew the family had a long history of isolating themselves, performing rituals and ceremonies away from town, but he had never imagined the extent of it until investigators arrived asking about the marriage. The keeper's voice trembled as he confessed that the woods had a memory of their own and that every secret buried there eventually found a way to rise again. He warned the investigators that the family's dead were not the only things hidden in the forest, and that disturbing the past could awaken forces that were never meant to be uncovered. The disappearance of the sheriff's deputy marked the moment when the investigation shifted from unsettling to genuinely dangerous. Deputy Mark Lanning was young, determined, and far less intimidated by the town's whispered warnings than his older colleagues. Where others hesitated, he pushed forward, convinced that the truth behind the abandoned cabin and the disturbing marriage certificate was buried somewhere on the family's land. He had spent days poring over old maps, tracing property lines that had long since dissolved into the forest. The land, once owned by the girl's family, stretched for miles beyond the cabin, into areas no one had willingly explored for generations. When Lanning announced he would hike out alone to document the remaining structures rumored to be deeper in the woods, the sheriff urged him to wait for backup, but the deputy insisted it would be a quick survey. He radioed in shortly after entering the tree line, his voice steady, promising to stay in contact. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. He described overgrown trails, collapsed fences, and what he believed were remnants of old footbridges crossing the creek. But as the sun dipped behind the hills, his tone changed. In his next transmission, he reported seeing lights between the trees, soft, wavering, like lanterns, but too far off the trail to investigate safely. He asked whether anyone else was in the woods. The sheriff confirmed no search teams had been dispatched. A few minutes later, Lanning's voice dropped to a whisper as he claimed he heard footsteps pacing parallel to his own, matching his movements even when he stopped. The radio crackled with static, followed by a tense pause, and then he muttered that someone was watching him from the shadows. Before the sheriff could respond, the transmission cut abruptly. When rescue teams arrived the next morning, they found Lanning's tire tracks near the trailhead but no sign of him inside the woods. His footprints suggested he had moved deeper into the forest than planned, following an unmarked path that wound toward the remnants of an old homestead. The trail ended near a clearing where the ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged across the soil. His radio was discovered shattered against a tree trunk, its casing cracked and smeared with dirt. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric or blood, nothing that pointed to an animal attack. It was as if the deputy had simply vanished into the stillness. Locals who heard of the disappearance refused to join the search, insisting that anyone who went looking would meet the same fate. The sheriff, shaken and uncharacteristically pale, ordered the investigation scaled back, citing safety concerns. But whispers spread through the town that the deputy had walked too close to something the family had left behind, something that guarded the forest as fiercely as it protected their secrets. The return of the lantern lights was the first undeniable sign that the forest had not relinquished its secrets, and that whatever lingered there was still very much alive. It began with scattered reports from local hunters and residents who lived near the edge of the woods, each describing dim, flickering lights moving between the trees long after sunset. At first, these accounts were dismissed as trickery or reflections of car headlights, but the sheer consistency of the sightings over several nights drew the attention of the investigators. People spoke in hushed tones about seeing small lanterns bobbing through the undergrowth, drifting in patterns that suggested intention, almost like someone or something was deliberately guiding them along hidden paths. The lights were not bright enough to illuminate the forest fully, but they cast shadows that stretched and twisted in ways that made observers uneasy. One hunter swore he saw 3 lights in a triangle formation, moving with a precision that no human could sustain over rough terrain. The pattern of the lights mirrored historical accounts of the family, who were rumored to conduct rituals and ceremonies at night, far from the prying eyes of the town. Elderly residents recalled tales of lanterns flickering through the forest decades earlier, carrying with them whispers and chants that faded before anyone could confirm their source. Now, in the present day, the recurrence of these lights seemed almost like a message, a reminder that the family's presence, or their legacy, was not bound by time. Investigators set out to document the phenomenon, moving cautiously through the woods at night, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dense foliage. Every time they thought they were close enough to intercept the lights, the lanterns would retreat deeper into the shadows, vanishing as if the forest itself had swallowed them. Those who pursued the lights too closely reported strange occurrences: a sudden drop in temperature, branches snapping behind them though no one was there, and an oppressive weight that pressed on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. One night, a search team followed a particularly persistent light for nearly half a mile before it disappeared near a section of the forest where trees grew unnaturally close together, forming a natural archway. Beneath the canopy, the air felt stagnant, almost alive, and a faint scent of damp earth mixed with burning wax lingered. Some team members claimed they saw fleeting figures at the edge of their vision, shapes that paused and watched before vanishing into the shadows. The lantern lights became more than just sightings. They were warnings, markers, and reminders that the woods were still under the family's influence. For investigators and locals alike, the phenomenon blurred the line between reality and legend. Each appearance left a lingering unease, a confirmation that whatever rituals or secrets had taken place decades ago, they had never truly ended. The lights moved with purpose, haunting the forest in patterns that suggested not just memory, but vigilance. The hidden journal beneath the cabin floorboards was discovered almost by accident, slipped into a narrow gap where the boards had rotted and warped with age. Its cover was cracked, the leather brittle, and the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple diary, the kind one might expect from a girl left isolated in the woods, but as investigators began to read, the entries revealed a reality far darker than anyone had anticipated. The handwriting was uneven and shaky, a mixture of childish scrawls and deliberate, forced strokes that suggested someone had repeatedly corrected her under supervision. From the very first pages, the tone of the journal betrayed fear, obedience, and confusion, as the girl recounted the long, lonely days spent in the cabin under the watchful eyes of her family, who insisted on secrecy and strict adherence to rules that no outsider could understand. The entries became progressively more disturbing as they chronicled the preparations for her wedding. She described being fitted into a dress that felt heavy and suffocating, sewn by hands that did not care for comfort or the girl's protest. She wrote of long nights when her uncle, the man she was forced to marry, would sit silently across the room, watching her every move, his expression unchanging, his presence suffocating. The journal hinted at rituals performed before the ceremony, small acts she didn't fully understand but felt compelled to obey, candles lit in precise patterns, whispered words in a language she could not recognize, and strange symbols drawn into the dirt outside the cabin. Each passage carried a sense of dread, a creeping awareness that something unnatural bound her family together, something older and more controlling than any ordinary law or social norm. Investigators were particularly struck by passages that described the community's silence, how her relatives warned her never to speak of the events outside the forest. She wrote of watching townspeople pass by the edge of the woods without realizing the horrors hidden within, their ignorance serving both as protection and punishment. In moments of rare defiance, she recorded attempts to leave the cabin or call for help, only to be intercepted and returned by relatives whose presence seemed almost spectral, arriving without warning or sound. The journal made it clear that her life was entirely dictated by the family's obsession with secrecy and bloodlines, a suffocating control that left no room for normal childhood experiences or personal agency. As the investigators turned the fragile pages, they realized that the journal was more than just a personal record, it was a blueprint of coercion, fear, and hidden ceremonies. Each entry revealed not only her suffering but also the calculated steps taken by her family to ensure their inbreeding remained hidden from the world. The journal's final surviving pages, smeared with tears and dirt, hinted at the wedding night itself, a ceremony filled with tension, ritual, and a sense of inevitability, offering chilling insight into a life trapped under the weight of a family legacy that no outsider had ever been meant to witness. The wedding night revelation emerged from the fragments of the girl's journal, pieced together with the faint memories recorded by the cabin's scattered artifacts, revealing a ceremony that had been deliberately hidden from the world. It was not simply a union of two people but a ritual designed to maintain a bloodline long considered sacred by the family, twisted into something grotesque by generations of secrecy and obsession. The entries described the atmosphere in the cabin on that night: heavy, suffocating air, flickering candlelight that cast strange, dancing shadows across the walls, and a silence so complete it felt as though the forest itself had leaned closer to listen. The girl wrote of being dressed in a white gown, stitched together with trembling hands, its fabric stiff and uncomfortable, symbolizing both purity and the family's control over her. She recounted the steps she was forced to follow, kneeling, standing, and speaking vows she did not understand, repeating words that seemed older than anyone could remember. Every action was supervised, every gesture scrutinized, and any hint of hesitation met with a silent, cold reprimand that left no room for resistance. The journal hinted at the presence of other figures in the shadows, their identities mostly obscured, but their purpose unmistakable. They were witnesses, guardians of the ritual, ensuring that the family's rules were followed to the letter. She wrote of the chanting that filled the cabin, low and rhythmic, intended to bind the participants together while reinforcing the notion of a sacred bloodline. These chants were not religious in the conventional sense but felt almost like incantations, phrases that carried weight and consequence, recited over and over until the air itself seemed charged with something unseen and oppressive. The girl's words revealed that she could sense the energy in the room, a palpable force pressing against her, compelling her to obey even when her mind screamed for freedom. As the night progressed, the journal entries became increasingly fragmented, the writing shaky and smudged with dirt and tears, hinting at the exhaustion and fear she endured. She described moments when the man she was forced to marry remained utterly still, staring forward with a blank expression that was at once human and inhuman. The ritual required him to participate in ways that were ceremonial rather than personal, emphasizing control and lineage over emotion or consent. The final entries suggested that the ceremony was not meant to be celebrated or witnessed by outsiders but to solidify a hidden order, an unbroken chain of family ties maintained through secrecy, manipulation, and fear. The pages ended abruptly, leaving the exact conclusion of the night obscured, but the implications were unmistakable. The wedding had been a calculated act, a ritual of inbreeding preserved under the cloak of isolation, intended to perpetuate a legacy the world was never meant to know. The night the woods started moving was the moment the investigators realized that the family's legacy had never truly left the forest. After weeks of studying the cabin, photographing the artifacts, and piecing together the girl's journal, the search team returned for a final sweep of the area, hoping to gather any remaining evidence that could confirm the family's existence and the extent of their hidden ceremonies. The forest was unusually still that evening, the kind of silence that presses on the ears and makes the air feel thick, as if it has been waiting. Lanterns swung faintly in the distance, just beyond the tree line, their flickering light suggesting motion but refusing to reveal the source. At first, the investigators assumed it was wildlife or other natural causes, but then the soft crunch of footsteps on dead leaves began to surround them from all directions. No one spoke, but every member of the team felt it. The forest itself was alive, aware, responding to their intrusion. As they moved deeper, shadows shifted along the trunks of ancient oaks, bending and stretching in ways that defied the angle of the lantern light. A sudden breeze carried whispers, low and indistinct, that seemed to echo words from the girl's journal. They spoke of obedience, secrecy, and bloodlines, murmured in tones both human and impossibly distant. When the team tried to pinpoint the source, the sounds seemed to leap from one tree to another, as if the forest itself were repeating the message. Branches snapped behind them, though nothing was visible. A rustling approached from ahead, then fell silent the moment anyone tried to focus on it. Every step forward was met with a sensation of being watched, and every glance revealed movement in the shadows that was not human in its rhythm or shape. One investigator swore he saw figures moving between the trees, human-like at first glance, but their limbs bent at unnatural angles, their faces hidden beneath hoods of darkness. Another reported that the lanterns appeared to converge on the cabin, swinging closer without any visible carriers, illuminating the ground in uneven, trembling circles. The team's compasses spun erratically, and electronic devices failed to function, as if the forest itself rejected intrusion by modern means. The further they advanced, the more the sense grew that the past and present were colliding, that the spirits of the family, their rituals, and the girl's suffering had imprinted themselves so deeply into the land that the forest had absorbed them. By the time the investigators realized the perimeter of the original clearing, they were surrounded by shadows that moved independently, forming shapes that mimicked figures from the photographs and journal entries. Every rustle, every flicker of lantern light, suggested a presence that had been waiting for decades, guarding the secret and the bloodline with a vigilance that transcended mortality. The forest was no longer just a setting, it was an entity, alive with memory, ritual, and warning, and the team understood that disturbing the cabin and uncovering the artifacts had awakened something that would not remain dormant, that the family's hidden history had become inseparable from the land itself.